Further into Richard Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche, intimations of a new worldview with the next section, which is called sort of synchronicity and its implications. And this is kind of what I wanted to get at. I mean, what we'd already talked about, but also this. And so, yeah, for me, this is sort of coming at the same time as studying Chetham and Corbin and Jung more and Heidegger, and it's sort of fitting into that context. But anyway, that's maybe not necessary to point to here. Okay, synchronicity and its implications. Most of us in the course of life have observed coincidences in which two or more independent events having no apparent causal connection, nevertheless seem to form a meaningful pattern. On occasion, this patterning can strike one as so extraordinary that it's difficult to believe the coincidence has been produced by chance alone. The events give the distinct impression of having been precisely arranged, invisibly orchestrated. Jung first described the remarkable phenomenon he named synchronicity in a seminar as early as 1928. He continued his investigations for more than 20 years before at last attempting a full formulation in the early 1950s. He presented his influential, still evolving analysis of synchronicity in the final paper he gave at the Eranos conferences, and immediately followed this with a long monograph. Developed in part through discussions with physicists, particularly Einstein and Wolfgang Pauli, the principle of synchronicity bore parallels to certain discoveries in relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Yet, because of its psychological dimension, Jung's concept possessed special relevance for the schism in the modern worldview between the meaning-seeking human subject and the meaning-voided objective world. From the beginning, it has held a unique position in contemporary discussions, having been simultaneously described by physicists as posing a major challenge to the philosophical foundations of modern science, and by religious scholars as holding deep implications for the modern psychology of religion. Within each decade, increasing numbers of books and heightened attention, both scholarly and popular, have been devoted to the concept and the phenomenon. Jung took particular interest in meaningful coincidences, in the beginning, no doubt because their frequent occurrence had exerted a considerable influence on his own life experience. He observed that in the therapeutic process of his patients, such events repeatedly played a role, sometimes a powerful one, especially in periods of crisis and transformation. The dramatic coincidence of meaning between an inner state and a simultaneous external event seemed to bring forth in the individual a healing moment toward psychological wholeness, mediated by the unexpected integration of outer and inner realities. Such events often engendered a new sense of personal orientation in a world now seen as capable of embodying purposes and meanings beyond the mere projections of human subjectivity. The random chaos of life suddenly appeared to veil a deeper order. A subtle sign, as it were, had been given, an unexpected color in the pale void of meaning, an intimation, in William James's phrase, of something more. Accompanying the more profound occurrences of synchronicity was a dawning intuition, sometimes described as having the character of a spiritual awakening, that the individual was herself or himself not only embedded in a larger ground of meaning and purpose, but also in some sense a focus of it. This discovery, often emerging after a sustained period of personal darkness or spiritual crisis, tended to bring with it an opening to new existential possibilities and responsibilities. Both because of this felt personal import and because of its startling metaphysical implications, such a synchronicity carried a certain numinosity, a dynamic spiritual charge with transformative consequences for the person experiencing it. In this respect, the phenomenon seemed to function, in religious terms, as something like an intervention of grace. Jung noted that such synchronicities were often kept secret or carefully guarded to avoid the possibility of ridicule concerning an event possessing such significant personal meaning. I just want to make a comment here because it's really not clear what he's drawn out from this, but the point that he's making is that there are not only particular moments of synchronicity, but that such moments can sort of reveal and point to a constant phenomena that are not moments of occasional synchronicity, but I don't know what I would say about it. It involves a sense or the awareness that in a way synchronicity is going on all the time. Only normally it's not focused into these concentrated moments. And so I think the attention to these specific moments of synchronicity, they lead to this in a way a different worldview, a sense that sort of self and cosmos unfold together in a certain way. And it's very important to keep that in mind because it's not the phenomenon of synchronicity is not just about these sort of heightened moments of meaning, but they're about something more permanent, more constant, less state bound. Anyway, so now we continue with Jung's description of synchronicity, which he says, as Tarnas says, the classic example of a pivotal synchronistic experience is Jung's well-known description of the golden scarab case. And I will read this. I just want to say that, yeah, I did a whole video on Jung on astrology, in which in the last half goes into great depth into Kieran Legrice's summary of the 7 different positions that Jung took toward astrology, about 4 of which involve his discussion of synchronicity and its implications, which is sort of directly relevant here. One important insight from that would be the sort of the profound significance of the archetypes that are the numbers 1 through 4 in particular, which is they provide through Pythagoras the idea that these numbers are in fact archetypal, and that structure a kind of order you could think of that is manifest both in the psyche and in the cosmos. I would then, to read the rest of Richard Tarnas's work, I would then want to read that back in, which I don't think he did. Yeah, and so the distinctions between what are called in that review by one Jungian commentator as sort of synchronicity 1 and synchronicity 2 are sort of equivalent to what I've just sort of described. One of them being this sort of these individual moments of profound coincidence and meaning, and the other being this sort of underlying background phenomena, which is sort of going on all the time, and coming with sort of metaphysical implications and a new sense of purpose and responsibility potentially, and like that. So I'll leave all of that there, and we'll go on with Jung's description. Tarnas says, we're quoting from Jung here. My example concerns a young woman patient who, in spite of efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose, namely a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccable geometrical idea of reality, as in Descartes' characteristic mode of logical demonstration. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day, with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had had an impressive dream the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me, gently tapping on the window. I turned round and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabæid beetle, or common rose chafer, Cetonia aurata, whose gold-green color most nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." This experience punctuated the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. Such a Jungian thing to say. Anyway, let's continue with Tarnas, who says, the acute coincidence between the symbolically resonant image that the woman had encountered in her dream the night before and was just then recounting, and the spontaneous appearance at the window of an insect that was the nearest, quote, the nearest analogy to a golden scarab that one finds in our latitudes, effectively broke through the intellectual armoring that had been blocking her psychological development. Now, quote, her natural being could burst through, and the process of transformation could at last begin to move. In another such instance, recounted in Esther Harding's notebooks, a patient whose dreams were filled with sexual imagery kept attempting to interpret the dreams in non-sexual symbolic terms, despite Jung's efforts to persuade her of their more plausible, straightforward meaning. On the day of her next appointment, 2 sparrows fluttered to the ground at the woman's feet and, quote, performed the act. Yeah, I mean, similar but less convincing example there. It's really hard to give examples of synchronicity because they're so dependent on the people who experience them, which is why they're also so risky in a way, epistemologically, because we're so subject to self-deception that you have to be very careful with this stuff. Anyway, let's go on with Tarnas, who says, on rare occasions, a synchronicity proves to have an extraordinary power through its impact on an historically significant individual, so that it ultimately plays a pivotal role in the collective life of the larger culture. The famous coincidence that formed the turning point in the life of Petrarch took place at the climax of his ascent of Mount Ventoux in April 1336, an event that has long been regarded by scholars as representing the symbolic beginning of the Renaissance. For many years, Petrarch had sensed a growing impulse to ascend the mountain, to see the vast panorama from its peak, though doing such a thing was virtually unheard of in his time. Finally choosing the day, with his brother for a companion, he made the long ascent, marked by intense physical exertion and inward reflection. When he at last attained the summit, with clouds below his feet and winds in his face, Petrarch found himself overwhelmed by the great sweep of the world that now opened out to him. Snow-capped mountains and the sea in the distance, rivers and valleys below, the wide expanse of skies in every direction. James Hillman recounts the event. Quote, at the top of the mountain, with the exhilarating view of French Provence, the Alps, and the Mediterranean spread before him, he had opened his tiny pocket copy of Augustine's Confessions. Turning at random to Book 10, Section 8, he read, and men go abroad to admire the heights of mountains, the mighty billows of the sea, the broad tide of rivers, the compass of the ocean, and the circuits of the stars, and pass themselves by. Petrarch was stunned at the coincidence between Augustine's words and the time and place they were read. His emotion both announced the revelation of his personal vocation and heralded the new attitude of the Renaissance. Petrarch draws this crucial conclusion from the Mont Ventoux event, quote, nothing is admirable but the soul. That was Hillman. We now continue with Tarnas, who says, Petrarch was so moved by the coincidental force of Augustine's words that he remained silent for the entire descent down the mountain. He at once recognized the coincidence as part of a larger pattern of such transformative moments that had happened to others in the history of spiritual conversions. I could not believe that it was by mere accident that I happened upon them. What I had there read I believed to be addressed to me and to no other. remembering that St. Augustine had once suspected the same thing in his own case. For indeed, Augustine had undergone a nearly identical experience at his own momentous spiritual turning point in the Garden of Milan in 386, the year 386. In a frenzy of spiritual crisis, he heard a child's voice from a nearby house, mysteriously repeating the words "Tolle leg," meaning pick up and read. Uncertain of their significance, he finally opened at random a copy of St. Paul's epistles, and there read words that spoke with uncanny precision to the nature of his lifelong conflict and its resolution. Immediately after reading which, quote, "the light of certainty flooded my heart, and all dark shadows of doubt fled away." Here too, Augustine's emotion in the Garden of Milan both announced the revelation of his personal vocation and heralded the new attitude of the Christian epoch being born. 1,000 years later, Augustine's own words, randomly encountered, provided a strikingly similar catalyzing force for Petrarch on Mont Ventoux. This time, the synchronistic epiphany unfolded in a new direction, and with different consequences. One revelation in the garden, pointing to Christianity in the Middle Ages, the other on the mountain, pointing to the Renaissance and modernity. Jung believed that synchronicities generally seem to serve the same role as dreams, psychological symptoms, and other manifestations of the unconscious, namely to compensate the conscious attitude and move the psyche from a problematic one-sidedness toward greater wholeness and individuation. Not only did the unexpectedly externalized pattern of meaning seem to represent more than mere chance coincidence, it also appeared to serve a definite purpose, impelling the psyche toward a more complete psychological and spiritual realization of the individual personality. This self-realization was achieved through a deeper integration of conscious and unconscious, which ultimately required of the individual a discerning surrender of the usual conscious attitude of knowing superiority. Discerning surrender. In this view, the perceptive interpretation of synchronistic phenomena, as with all expressions of the unconscious, rather than inflating the egocentric importance of the individual in a narcissistic manner, could correct precisely these tendencies and open the psyche to a larger vision. An instructive example of this self-critical compensatory approach towards synchronicity in Jung's own life was recounted by Henry Fiers when he described a meeting with Jung in the 1950s. Fiers had come to discuss whether Jung thought a manuscript by a scientist who had recently died should be published. At the appointed hour of 5 o'clock, Fiers arrived for the meeting and the discussion began. Quote, "Jung had read the book and he thought that it should not be published, but I disagreed and was for publication. Our discussion finally got rather sharp, and Jung looked at his wristwatch, obviously thinking that he had spent enough time on the matter and that he could send me home. Looking at his watch, he said, 'When did you come?' I, 'At 5, as agreed.' Jung, 'But that's queer. My watch came back from the watchmaker this morning after a complete revision, and now I have 5:05. But you must have been here much longer. What time do you have?' I, 'It's 5:35. Whereupon Jung said, 'So you have the right time, and I the wrong one. Let's discuss the thing again.' This time I could convince Jung that the book should be published. I'm just going to find out which book it was. It was the Red Book, as it turns out. As in Jung's Red Book. Let's continue with Tarnas, who says, here, the synchronistic event is of interest not because of its intrinsic coincidental force, but because of the meaning Jung drew from it, essentially using it as a basis for challenging and redirecting his own conscious attitude. The unexpected stopping and resulting error of the watch was immediately recognized by Jung as paralleling and as thereby bringing to his attention what he then suspected might be a comparable stoppage and error in his own thinking about the matter at hand, the publication of the Red Book. He was alert to the fact that the two events, one inner and the other outer, would have taken place at virtually the same moment. Rather than automatically assuming that there could be no significant connection between the state of his watch and the state of his thinking, which would certainly be the usual assumption, his immediate intuition was of a larger field of meaning, underlying and patterning all that happened in the room at the time. In that sense, in that field, events having no apparent causal connection in the conventional sense could be recognized as participating in a more subtly ordered whole, a larger pattern of meaning that was discernible to the prepared mind, even if that meaning challenged his conscious attitude. For Jung, the symbolic connection between the two events was as transparently intelligible as if he were reading a newspaper, and he acted accordingly. What made the correlation between the inner and outer events intelligible was the presence of two factors. First, a developed capacity for thinking and perceiving symbolically. A developed capacity for thinking and perceiving symbolically. A cultivated sensitivity to metaphoric and analogical patterns that connect and thereby illuminate diverse phenomena. And second, an epistemological openness to the possibility that such meaning can be carried by the outer world as well as by the inner. By all of nature and one's surrounding environment, not just by the human psyche. Yet the recognition of synchronicities requires subtle judgments made in circumstances usually pervaded by ambiguity and open to multiple interpretations. The suggestive patterning and often delicate precision of details in such coincidences notoriously escape the net of objectivistic assessments and experimental tests. Synchronicities seem to constitute a lived reality, the experience of which depends deeply on the sensitive perception of context and nuance. For synchronicities have a shadow side, as in the exaggeration of the trivial to discover a self-inflating meaning. Another form this shadow can take is the paranoid's morbidly narrow interpretation of coincidences in terms of other people's malign plots, cunningly directed at the self, or psychotic delusions of self-reference. Such interpretations are, as Jung once suggested, pre-Copernican, egocentric. They center the world of meaning naively on the old narrow self, meaning ego, inflating the separate ego or persecuting it, and thereby evade the more complex and often painful emergence of the, quote, individuated self that is in dialogue with the whole. Such an emergence requires attending to the claims and communications of the larger cosmos of the universe. A painstaking cultivation of self-knowledge must be undertaken to avoid succumbing to mere projection. Discriminating such events requires a self-critical awareness of unconscious tendencies toward narcissistic distortion, by which random or peripheral events are continually transformed into signs of an egocentric universe. No less crucial is the development and balanced interplay of multiple faculties of cognition: empirical, rational, emotional, relational, intuitive, and symbolic. A capacity for acute yet balanced discernment has to be forged, founded not only on an alertness to meaningful pattern, but also on a disciplined mindfulness of the larger whole within which the individual seeks orientation, within which the individual self seeks orientation. Today, a half-century after Jung's original formulation of the principle of synchronicity, with both the concept and the phenomenon now so widely recognized, one can discern a typical sequence and progression in the nature of synchronistic events and responses. The first stage is usually marked by the experience of various ambiguously suggestive coincidences and patternings that may seem somewhat remarkable, curious, or even vaguely uncanny, but can still be regarded as perhaps merely fortuitous or subjective, and are therefore usually ignored and forgotten. Eventually, there may occur one or more especially powerful synchronicities, unambiguous in their coincidental force and precision of patterning, that have a revelatory effect on the individual and mark a decisive threshold in his or her psychological and spiritual development. Not infrequently, synchronicities of this category occur in association with births, deaths, crises, and other major turning points in life. On occasion, there may take place a sudden convergence of many such synchronicities, intricately interconnected, occurring in close proximity or in rapid succession, and having the effect of an overpowering epiphany of new meaning and purpose in the life of an individual. Over time, however, after this threshold has been crossed, new attitude towards synchronicities often emerges as their frequency and character come to seem part of life's pervasive intelligence and artistry, less a paradigm-shifting revelation of a new order of reality, and more a continuing source of meaning and orientation with which to participate in life with greater sensitivity and intelligence. A disciplined alertness to significant pattern in the outer world, as well as inner, begins to develop as an essential aspect of living a more conscious life. The occurrence of synchronicities is seen as permitting a continuing dialogue with the unconscious and the larger whole of life, while also calling forth an aesthetic and a spiritual appreciation of life's powers of symbolically resonant complex patterning. Oh. Although Jung himself did not explicitly describe this later stage in his principal monograph on synchronicity, it is evident from many scattered passages in his writings and from the recollections and memoirs of others that he lived both his life and conducted his clinical practice. That he both lived his life and conducted his clinical practice in a manner that entailed a constant attention to potentially meaningful synchronistic events that would then shape his understanding and actions. Jung saw nature and one's surrounding environment as a living matrix of potential synchronistic meaning that could illuminate the human sphere. He attended to sudden or unusual movements or appearances of animals, flocks of birds, the wind, storms, the suddenly louder lapping of the lake outside the window of his consulting room, and similar phenomena as possessing possible symbolic relevance for the parallel unfolding of interior psychological realities. For the woman who had the dream of the golden scarab, the next day's synchronistic visitation through the window was dramatically transformative. Whereas the same event for Jung represented a striking but not uncharacteristic example of the meaningful pattern of inner and outer events to which he had long before learned to be attentive. In sharp contrast to the modern worldview, Jung ceased to regard the outer world as merely a neutral background against which the human psyche pursued its isolated intrasubjective quest for meaning and purpose. Rather, all events, inner and outer, whether emanating from the human unconscious or from the larger matrix of the world, were recognized as sources of potential psychological and spiritual significance. From this perspective, not only the individual psyche and not only humanity's collective unconscious, but all of nature supported and moved the human psyche towards a larger consciousness of purpose and meaning. There is then an extended footnote, which I will read because it's relevant. Robert Aziz comments, quote, "For Jung, the call to individuate arises from the deepest sources of life and is supported inwardly and outwardly by the compensatory activities of nature. It is a call, therefore, that is not to be taken lightly. Both inwardly and outwardly, nature strives unceasingly to bring about the realization, in the life of the individual, of a unique pattern of meaning. as evidenced by his own writings on synchronicity, and perhaps more importantly, by the way he lived his own life. The individuation process extends beyond the psychological realm and assumes the character of a drama that takes the whole of nature for its stage. What we normally regard as the discontinuous inner and outer worlds become enclosed within the same circle of wholeness. Inwardly and outwardly, nature works through the compensatory patterning of events to further the movement of the individual toward wholeness. Now one is challenged to achieve a full understanding of the meaning that conjoins one not only to the unconscious, but to nature in its entirety. This is the new spiritual challenge of individuation. It is the task of experiencing within the sacred circle of nature as a whole the meaning of an individual existence. That's taken from a text, C.G. Jung's Psychology of Religion and Synchronicity by Roet as is. And Tarnas continues in the same footnote. Jung's attitude closely resembles the characteristic primal and shamanic alertness to nature's symbolically significant patterning, as well as ancient Chinese Taoist philosophy, in which the dominant principles are pattern, order, symbolic correlations, the unity of human and cosmos, and the interdependence of all things. Richard Wilhelm, in The Secret of the Golden Flower, comments, Chinese philosophy is built on the premise that the cosmos and man, in the last analysis, obey the same law, that man is a microcosm and is not separated from the macrocosm by any fixed barriers. The very same laws rule for the one as for the other, and from the one, a way leads into the other. The psyche and the cosmos are to each other like the inner world and the outer world. Therefore, man participates by nature in all cosmic events and is inwardly as well as outwardly interwoven with them. Then we get a quote from Joseph Needham in his text Science and Civilization in China. Quote, the key word in Chinese thought is order, and above all, pattern. The symbolic correlations or correspondences all formed part of one colossal pattern. Things behaved in particular ways, not necessarily because of prior actions or impulsions of other things, but because their position in the ever-moving cyclical universe was such that they were endowed with intrinsic natures, which made that behavior inevitable for them. They were thus parts in existential dependence upon the whole world organism. And they reacted upon one another, not so much by mechanical impulsion or causation, as by a kind of mysterious resonance. Okay, I might just also mention that this would comport directly with what we're understanding as sort of Jung's sort of understanding of archetypes as being psychoid, meaning sort of constituting both psyche and cosmos. That's played out in his sort of elaboration of the archetypes of numbers through Pythagoras that I was talking about. So one doesn't need to appeal only to Chinese philosophy. I'm saying, hey, Pythagoras as well. Okay, let's return to the main body of the text, from which we get a short quote from Jung and then another footnote, which I will also return to. It's a long one again, but that's okay. So Tarnas was saying, rather all events, inner and outer, whether emanating from the human unconscious or from the larger matrix of the world, were recognized as sources of potential psychological and spiritual significance. From this perspective, not only the individual psyche, and not only humanity's collective unconscious, but all of nature supported and moved the human psyche toward a larger consciousness of purpose and meaning. Each moment in time possessed a certain tangible character or quality which pervaded the various events taking place at that moment. Quote, this is Jung. It seems, indeed, as though time, far from being an abstraction, is a concrete continuum, which contains qualities or fundamentals which can manifest themselves in relative simultaneousness in different places and in a parallelism which cannot be explained, as in cases of simultaneous appearance of identical thoughts, symbols, or psychic conditions. Whatever is born or done at this particular moment in time has the quality of this moment of time. I'm now going to read the fifth footnote, which is about a page and a half long. And it goes, this formulation of synchronicity in terms of qualitative time from 1930 reflects Jung's early astrological research beginning in 1911 and his experiments throughout the 1920s with the I Ching. Jung's first theorizing about synchronicity was done with reference, this is a quote, Jung's first theorizing about synchronicity was done with reference to astrology in the I Ching and focused on the fact that things arising in a particular moment of time all share the characteristics of that moment. It appears to have been this understanding of the role of time, an understanding in which simultaneity does indeed play an essential part, which led Jung to coin the term synchronicity, with its emphasis on the element of time. Syn, from the Greek, syn meaning together and chronos meaning time. Synchronicity, together in time. That's from an author named R. Main, Jung on Synchronicity and the Paranormal. Tarnas continues. And again, this is, I already referenced the episode on Jung and astrology that I did, which is very helpful here because it describes the ins and outs and the changing in Jung's position regarding synchronicity, which Tarnas is talking about. And he says, in later years, Jung increasingly focused on synchronicity's parallels with 20th century physics. He was influenced first by his conversations about relativity with Einstein, a dinner guest on several occasions in the 1909 to 12 period, and several decades later through his discussions about quantum mechanics with his patient and friend Wolfgang Pauli. Reflecting the parallels with both physics and the parapsychological experiments of J.B. Rhine at Duke University that started in the 1930s, Jung began to broaden the concept of synchronicity to include many phenomena. Various paranormal phenomena such as precognition and telepathy, the discontinuities of modern physics, the properties of natural numbers, for which simultaneity, qualitative time, and meaning were not always relevant factors. Instead, he began to stress, quote, the psychic relativization of time and space and general acausal orderedness. However, as many commentators have noted, Koestler, Aziz, Mansfield, and Main, some of these additions stretched the parameters of the concept to include phenomena for which the original term synchronicity was now problematic and less obviously appropriate. In his efforts to include the various phenomena from parapsychology and physics, Jung essentially combined into one overarching concept several separate classes of events, in many cases seemed to confuse and overlook their fundamental differences. For example, an especially important difference was concealed by Jung's conflation of two basic categories: the meaningful coincidence of simultaneous events and the experience of clairvoyant cognition. The first category can be said to represent the classic form of synchronicity, illustrated by the paradigm case of the Golden Scarab, in which the outer world unexpectedly brought forth a concrete external event that closely paralleled, in meaning, a simultaneous psychological state. The second category of clairvoyant cognition was centered on cases in which an individual experienced internally, by intuition, dream, or vision, some external event in a future time or at a distant location. But it is only the first category, the one on which Jung placed far greater emphasis, that the crucial possibility of a meaning-embedded world presents itself, one that has all the metaphysical implications associated with the concept of synchronicity. By contrast, In cases of paranormal experiences, like clairvoyance, telepathy, and precognition, the individual in question can be seen as simply exercising some not yet understood perceptual or cognitive faculty that has no implications for the outer world's capacity to embody meaning in a manner that transcends the human psyche. Such cases would thus provide evidence pointing only to the need for a revised understanding of human abilities and the parameters of human consciousness. In other cases, such as those in the parapsychological experiments and in quantum physics, present comparable differences, as well as additional ones that eliminate the presence of meaning as a central factor altogether. It seems likely that the scientific status of physics and the statistical experimental nature of the parapsychological research played a significant role in moving Jung in the above direction, encouraging him to modify the terms of his original concept and add further categories to it in his hope to elevate the viability of his challenging hypothesis in the science-dominated intellectual ethos of the mid-20th century. This also perhaps explains Jung's 1954 letter to André Barbault, in which he contrasted synchronicity with the qualitative time hypothesis he had earlier proposed, suggesting now that the idea of synchronicity replaced rather than manifested the principle of qualitative time. Jung here described the latter, the principle of qualitative time, as tautological, because time in itself consists of nothing and is only qualified or defined by events. This apparent change in Jung's position probably reflected not only his larger shift in emphasis toward a more broadly inclusive and science-oriented formulation of the synchronicity principle, but also his desire to locate the essence of synchronistic phenomena in the parallel patterning of the phenomena themselves, rather than in some a priori characteristics of time apart from the phenomena. Thus, contrary to some commentaries on this topic, Jung's later objection was not to the idea of time having a de facto qualitative dimension, but rather to the idea that time itself was the a priori determining factor of the observed qualities. Instead, Jung clearly viewed the determining factor in the sense of what arranged the qualitative patterning in the flux of events to be not time per se, but rather the constellated archetype. In Aristotelian terms, the archetype is the formal cause of the synchronicity. Time is thus regarded as possessing a qualitative dimension, but the quality that will be manifest at any given time is indeterminate and potential until a specific archetype is constellated. In retrospect, again, this would comport with what I was saying about Pythagoras, where sort of the archetypes, including archetypes of number, are regarded as a sort of organizing principle of both psyche and cosmos, and that it's not about time, it's about the archetypes, essentially. That's what's being said. And Tarnas continues, in retrospect, by the time Jung wrote his principal analysis on synchronicity in the early 1950s, his increasing focus on parapsychology and physics had, in a sense, partly colonized the original concept, and thus obscured the reality of how he had integrated his experience of meaningful coincidences into his life and clinical practice. Jung's original and most familiar examples of synchronicities emerged in psychological, therapeutic, religious, divinatory, and esoteric contexts, as compared with experimentally tested extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, out-of-body and near-death experiences, and other paranormal phenomena, and the discontinuities of physics, for all of which alternative explanations have been given that are arguably more apt than synchronicity. For the more characteristic original categories of meaningful coincidences, such as the golden scarab and stopped watch examples cited in the text, the idea of qualitative time, i.e., time as possessing a qualitative dimension, along with the elements of simultaneity and meaning, clearly remains relevant as part of a larger theoretical conception in which the archetypal meaning that informs and connects the synchronistic events serves as a fundamental explanatory principle. Many aspects of relativity and quantum mechanics are indeed relevant to synchronistic phenomena. A relativized space-time continuum, the collapse of strict linear causality, and of a full independent objective world. Complementarity, probabilistic indeterminacy, non-locality, and the interconnected and interdependent nature of reality. Other essential elements of synchronicities, however, have no parallels in physics. Above all, the fundamental presence of meaning as the structuring factor and the apparent teleological or purposive aspect of such events. Final paragraph here. In traditional philosophical terms, these two basic elements of synchronicities, meaning and purpose, represent straightforward expressions of what Aristotle termed formal and final causes, respectively. Compared with the simpler or simplistic modern view of causality, which is entirely linear mechanistic in nature, Aristotle's more nuanced and capacious formulation defined cause as that which is a necessary, though not in itself sufficient, condition for the existence of something. Such conditions included formal and final teleological factors, in addition to the material and efficient factors stressed by mainstream modern science. When Jung originally employed the term acausality and emphasized that synchronicities were fundamentally acausal in nature, he provided a helpful and probably necessary counterpoint to the narrow conventional scientific understanding of linear mechanistic causality that was then nearly ubiquitous. But the clear applicability of Aristotle's richer classical formulation of causality for understanding synchronicities within a Jungian archetypal and teleological perspective places in question the continued usefulness or appropriateness of the term acausality in this context. And so what I'm going to do is I don't want the final pages of the essay to be hidden behind the footnotes that I just gave, which I think was probably a mistake. So what I'm going to do is record the last bit separately. Okay.